This is the fourth video lecture on the topic of race and ethnicity. The last one we ended up talking about prejudice, and I did not get to discrimination, so I'm going to pick up at discrimination and maybe get to some theories. So whereas prejudice is defined as an idea or a belief or an attitude, usually negative, not always, you can have positive prejudices. Discrimination is the action, right? So discrimination is when you to discriminate, when you are a discriminating person, it simply means that you are thoughtful and you choose some things over another, right? So again, we usually think about discrimination in a negative way, but we also can discriminate in a positive way when we give preference or bias to, to something as opposed to something else. Most of the time when we talk about discrimination, we talk about it in terms of individual level discrimination. So I discriminate when I think that dark-haired boys are more attractive than light-haired boys, right? Or I discriminate when I pick red apples over yellow apples, right? So, but remember, sociologically, there is no such thing as the individual. So sociologists are really more interested, and the anti-racist that I made reference to is really more interested in what's referred to as institutional discrimination. And this is where there are policies put into place that systematically exclude people, right? So if you look on your chapter outline, we offer a couple, and if we were together, we'd have had a conversation about this, right? When a corporation fills an open position with an in-house candidate instead of advertising, who does that give preference to? Who does that exclude? Who does that systematically exclude? It doesn't say you, person A, are excluded and you, person B, are included, but it does create a structure so that certain people have advantages that other people don't. And in this case, it's people that work there, right? Children of alumni receive preference for admission to private schools. Who does that exclude? Who does that give preferential admission status to? Public meetings are held on the third floor, right? And there's no elevator. So who is systematically excluded? And again, it doesn't say you, Sage, who happens to be in a wheelchair, are excluded. It says that a whole segment, a whole group of people, right? So going back to chapter 1, when we were talking about what groups do you belong to, you know, if you are able-bodied and you can take the stairs, you belong to the group of able-bodied people. And so your group is not systematically excluded. A fire department requires that people be 5'8" or taller. A person accused of a crime, this is one that I always think is interesting. A person accused of crime can't post bail and has to show up to his hearing in his prison clothes, right? Who is systematically excluded, or who is treated differently, and what are the criteria with being treated differently? All of those are different kinds of institutional discrimination because they give a group, if you belong to that group, it gives you preference, or it makes it harder if you don't belong to that group, right? So I want to talk just a second about how prejudice and discrimination are thought to work together, and how if I hold individual prejudices, if I personally have a bias, how I can then create a systematic bias. So let me use the example of red apples and green apples. So I happen to like red apples, and I've eaten plenty of red apples, and I tried a green apple one time and I didn't like it, right? In other words, I have black friends, right? So I know that red apples are better than green apples because I've tried a green apple and I've tried a red apple, and I clearly like red apples better. Well, I get hired because I know so much about apples. I get hired to work at a grocery store, and I am the produce manager, where I get to pick how many apples to buy. Well, I know that some people like green apples, and so I'm going to buy a few green apples, but most people, at least all my friends, we all like red apples. So I'm going to buy 10 cases of red apples and only 2 cases of green apples, because I know some people like them, but most people will prefer red apples, right? So as the month wears on, sure enough, I get to the end of the month and I've sold a lot more red apples than green apples. And I can say, see, told you so. I thought other people liked more red apples. So since I'm not selling very many green apples, I think the next month, I'm going to order like only half as many green apples as I ordered before. And I'm going to order the same amount of red apples. So I sell all these red apples. I'm not selling very many green apples. And then I can say, I don't know why people don't buy as many green apples, right? Well, and maybe I'm only buying one kind of green apple and I'm buying 3 kinds of red apples. So, you know, maybe that particular Granny Smith is too tart, but if I'd have bought, you know, Golden Delicious green apples, then I could have sold more. But I'm not selling these Granny Smiths, so why try different green apples? I hope that kind of makes some sense, right? But it's the idea, and then we talk about how racism becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and how people of color internalize the white, what's referred to as the white supremacy. So, you know, I may like green apples, but I come into the grocery store and I notice that there's only a couple and there's all these red apples. So red apples must be better. What am I not seeing? You know, I've always liked green apples, but clearly, you know, everybody else here likes red apples. So I'll try those too. And I must be wrong. Red apples must be better. Right. So I'm just not going to buy my green apples anymore. And it's the idea then that we systematically give more opportunities for people to buy red apples, and we get systematically make it harder for the green apple producers to sell their product, right? I hope those metaphors sort of uh, work a little bit. But anyway, the idea is one's a belief and one's an action, right? And my individual belief may translate into my individual action, but my individual belief may also be limited, right? My individual belief that green apples are better, but I go to the grocery store and there's only one kind and there's 3 kinds of red apples. Well, I'll pick the red ones simply because they're fresher and there's more choices. And I may not pick the green one. They might actually be more expensive because there's not as many. So I'll pick the red. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Theories of intergroup relations. So these are our 3 sociological theories again: functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. Functionalism. So the question here is, what is the function of racism? And if we were together, I would ask you that, like, what purpose do you think it serves? What purpose do you think people saying hateful things, or or these English only movements, what purpose do they serve? Well, the same way with deviance, they serve assimilation and conformity. If you are a member of a group and there's a lot of discrimination and there's a lot of hostility directed towards you, you will either change so that you're like the main group. So you will either buy the red apples because you don't want people making fun of you for eating green apples. So you'll either assimilate, or you'll conform, right? I really do like the green ones, but I'm not going to buy them because people make fun of green apple eaters, right? I really do like dressing like that, or I do prefer to speak in my native language, but people think that I'm a terrorist if I wear my head covering, and so I won't. I'll conform, and this is called acculturation, or acculturation and assimilation. But it's the idea that I take on the ways of the dominant group. I act white, and there can often be, especially between immigrant families, there's a tension between the first generation of immigrants and, say, the grandchildren of the immigrants, because the grandchildren want what's called Americanize, right? They take on the ways of the Americans to fit in, to be a part of their peer group. But the older generation wants to hold on to their ethnic heritage, right? Because that ethnocentrism, and so there can be intergenerational conflict. This is exactly what was going on with First Peoples when the Christians built the boarding schools and made it and would beat the children for speaking their native language, or made them wear white people clothes instead of their indigenous clothes. It was all to Americanize them, to teach the, I think it was the savage, they were trying to train the savage out. Conflict theory says that racism and prejudice are really all about maintaining group divisions, and that some groups benefit the people at the top, usually white people, right, whoever had the power. They benefit from racism and they promote it and perpetuate it. So again, thinking back to the triangle, I think this next time I want to draw a triangle, thinking back to that triangle, right, that the people at the top promote racism to keep the masses at the bottom in conflict. So if you have a whole bunch of poor white people and a whole bunch of poor black people, right, and if all those poor people work together, they could change the social structure, right? And they could make it hard for the people at the top. So what the people at the top do is they create a system of racism and mistrust amongst the people at the bottom, inter-group conflict. So instead of all poor people saying, hey man, we're all poor and we're exploited by the people at the top, all the poor people say, I don't trust that black person. I don't trust that brown person. And so the poor people end up fighting amongst themselves, right? As a way so that they don't create solidarity, social class solidarity. This happens during the slavery era too, where if you were a high-ranking slave, you could gain privileges by turning runaway slaves in. And who benefited from that? Well, the slave owner benefited from that, right? But it's that middle manager, it's the high-ranking slave that turned in the lower-ranking slave. He was also exploited. Instead of seeing themselves all as slaves, they thought they were benefiting, but they were really taking advantage of it. This is sort of what conflict theory says. Now, internal colonization. This is another concept that says that that in any economic system, there's a group of people that are the most exploited. So, like I think about Manhattan, we have a system of people's labor, the students, and when times are good, those students they're the last ones hired, first ones fired, kind of thing, right? You have to have this poor. A good example would be the migrant farm workers, right? That when there's work, we put them to work, but whenever times get tough, we want them to go away. This group of people, they're the lowest ranking in society. They have the fewest benefits, the fewer attachments, and we take advantage of their labor when there are resources and when there's work to be done. But as soon as times get tough, they're the first ones that we let go, and we kind of pretend they're not there. And then finally, because my time's running up on this one, symbolic interactionism. What this theory says is that, and this is a little bit different, this theory says that race is not, that race is a way of being, that we do race. So if you think about how people act white or act black, right, that race is not the way that I look, but race is the way that I be. Race is the way that I act. And that certain ways of being are considered less than others. So racism still exists, but it's not as much based on the way that I physically look, the fur I have or the skin that I have. It's how I be, the music I listen to, the clothes that I wear, the language that I use, the way that I talk, the way that I walk. And that we have ranked people based on their way of being, not their way of appearance. I think, and then symbolic and then contact theory. And what contact theory says is a really cool idea, that it says that the more people that you know, like if the closer you are with people of different races, the less the less of a racist you will be. That simply by that it's in this interaction, this individual level interaction, that we undo racism. And that people who have a roommate of a different racial or different ethnic group, that they are less likely to be racist. So people that travel, military people, all of that sort of stuff. And I'm going to stop that right here. And when we get back, I'll talk about some of the other intergroup relationships.